Me hate you, love you. So pick me, choose me, love me.
She says she hates drama, prefers hanging out with the boys, and swears she's not like other girls. Sounds familiar? It's the modern-day pick-me girl. It's a viral archetype that's taken over social media in recent years. She's mocked, dissected, and even memed into oblivion, but the truth is, she's not new. For centuries, women have been told to compete, conform, or stand out, but only in ways that please society. What we're seeking on social media is just the latest chapter in a long history of women performing femininity in a world that often pits them against each other. So how did we get here? In today's video, we are diving deep into the pick-me girl phenomenon, where it started, how it evolved, and what it tells us about the ongoing fight for women's empowerment. Trust me, this is about so much more than social media trends. Chapter 1. What is a pick-me girl? The pick-me girl is a social archetype that's taken on a life of its own in the age of social media. She's the girl who loudly proclaims that she isn't like other girls, often positioning herself as a more laid-back, chill, or real compared to her female peers. You've likely encountered phrases like, I don't wear makeup, I don't need it, I'd rather stay home and eat pizza than go shopping. Girls are just so much drama, I can't deal with them. At first glance, this might seem harmless or even relatable. After all, who hasn't tried to highlight their individuality at some point? But the issue with the pick-me girl isn't her desire to stand out. It's the way she does it by tearing down other women, often catering to male approval in the process. The pick-me girl archetype thrives on comparison. She elevates herself by rejecting traits that are traditionally coded as feminine, whether it's wearing makeup, liking fashion, or even having close female friendships. And the irony? These traits aren't inherently bad or good, but in a patriarchal society, anything seen as too girly is often dismissed as shallow or unworthy of respect. The internalized misogyny pushes pick-me girls to distance themselves from other women, perpetuating the idea that femininity is something to be ashamed of, something that makes a woman less valuable in the eyes of a man. It's less about genuine self-expression and more about aligning with male-dominated expectations of what's cool or low maintenance. The pick-me girl exists because society has long conditioned women to see one another as competitors. Historically, women's survival and social standing often depended on securing the favor of men. Even in today's more progressive societies, echoes of these dynamics persist in subtle and not so subtle ways. Social norms still teach women that being different, especially in ways that align with male preferences, is the ultimate compliment. Think about the popularity of phrases like, she's not high maintenance, or she's just one of the guys. These are rooted in the idea that women should mold themselves into something that's easier, more palatable, or less intimidating for men. In the age of social media, the pick-me girl has become a hyper-visible archetype. Social media platforms like TikTok have created spaces for women to highlight and critique this behavior, often using humor and satire. Hashtags like pick-me-girl or trending meme have turned her into a caricature, with exaggerated traits and catchphrases that make her an easy target. While this has led to some great conversations about internalized misogyny, it's also created a new layer of judgment, this time from other women. The cycle of women being pitted against one another continues, but now it's playing out in a digital arena for all of us to see. But here's the thing, the pick-me girl isn't a new phenomenon. She's just the latest version of a centuries-old archetype. Throughout history, women have been socialized to navigate male-dominated spaces by competing with one another, whether through looks, charm, or conforming to societal expectations. To truly understand the pick-me girl, we need to zoom out and look at the historical forces that created her. Why has society repeatedly pitted women against one another? How have ideas of femininity and desirability evolved over time? And what can we do to break this cycle moving forward? Chapter 2. Historical roots and the birth of the ideal woman. Long before the pick-me girl entered our vocabulary, societies across the world had already laid the foundation for this behavior. Throughout history, women have been conditioned to conform to certain ideas of femininity, ideals that have been shifted with time but have always evolved around one key principle: male approval. From the prim and proper ladies of the Victorian era to the silver screen stars of the early Hollywood, women have been taught to compete for attention by embracing qualities deemed desirable by men. men. This wasn't just social conditioning, it was often a matter of survival. In societies where women had limited legal and economic rights, securing a man's favor wasn't just about romance. It was about stability, security, social status, and survival. In the Victorian era, the dominant ideal for women was the angel of the house, a concept derived from Coventry Patmore's 1854 poem of the same name. The angel was self-sacrificing, gentle, and entirely devoted to her husband and children. She was the moral center of the household, expected to embody purity and grace while maintaining an almost saint-like patience and modesty. But this ideal only functioned when it had an opposite, the fallen woman. Any woman who stepped outside the rigid expectations of femininity, whether by displaying too much ambition, rejecting marriage, or embracing her sexuality, was socially ostracized. Literature of the time, from Pride and Prejudice to Jane Eyre, often reinforced this dichotomy, showing that a woman's worth depended entirely on how well she conformed to these standards. Women who wanted to be chosen as a wife and secure their place in society quickly learned that they had to position themselves as an angel, often by subtly distancing themselves from women who were deemed too independent, too opinionated, or too unladylike. Does this sound familiar? This was an early blueprint for what we now recognize as the pick-me behavior, separating oneself from the wrong kind of woman in order to gain favor. As we entered the 20th century, the concept of the ideal woman evolved, but the idea of competing among women remained. The Edwardian era introduced the reign of the debutante, where young women from wealthy families were formally introduced into society at grand balls. Their ultimate goal was to attract a suitable husband. These young women were trained in etiquette, fashion, and charm, reinforcing the idea that their success depended on outshining their peers in beauty and refinement. Meanwhile, the emerging film industry gave rise to a new kind of ideal woman, the Hollywood starlet. Silent film actresses like Mary Pickford, Greta Garbo, and Clara Bow were adored by audiences and shaped perceptions of femininity. However, even within this glamorous world, women were subjected to the same social pressures. Magazines at the time frequently pitted actresses against one another, with headlines like the Battle of the Screen Sirens, reinforcing the idea that there was only room for a select few at the top. Women who wanted to remain desirable often had to downplay their intelligence or ambition, presenting themselves as effortlessly charming and demure. Yet another precursor to the modern-day cool girl and pick-me girl. The 1920s saw a radical shift in women's roles. The flapper era symbolized rebellion against Victorian-era constraints. Women were cutting their hair, wearing shorter skirts, smoking, drinking, and openly challenging traditional norms. The new woman of the Jazz Age was independent, career-minded, and sexually liberated. But even with the so-called revolution, there were contradictions. The flapper wasn't entirely free. She was still performing, just in a different way. She had to be modern and daring, but still attractive to men. Women who were deemed too radical, too political, or too aggressive in their feminism were often pushed to the margins, while those who embodied a more palatable version of rebellion, fun-loving but not threatening, were celebrated. This was another early version of the pick-me behavior. Flappers who wanted to be seen as cool distanced themselves from more traditional women while also making sure they weren't too radical, ensuring that they remained desirable in the eyes of men. In the 1930s and 40s, Hollywood became the most powerful force in shaping female archetypes. Women in film were presented in two extremes, either the wholesome, marriageable woman or the dangerous femme fatale. Actresses like Jean Harlow and Ginger Rogers embodied the ideal girlfriend or wife, charming, fun, and supportive of their male counterparts. Meanwhile, femme fatale characters in noir films like Rita Hayworth and Gilda, or Barbara Stanwyck in Double Indemnity, represented the wrong kind of woman, seductive, manipulative, and ultimately punished for her power. Women who wanted to be seen as respectable and desirable took cues from these portrayals, ensuring that they were perceived as one of the good ones. The media fueled division between good women and bad women continued to reinforce the idea that a woman's best chance to success was to differentiate herself from those who were being seen as less respectable. By the 1940s, women had entered the workforce in huge numbers due to World War II. They had proven their ability to work, to lead, and to be independent. But as the war ended, so did the temporary shift. Society wasn't ready to let go of old gender roles just yet. The return of soldiers meant a push to get women out of the workforce and back into the home. home. Advertisements, films, and magazines all sent a clear message. The ideal woman was once again a devoted wife and mother. The 1950s would take the idea of the perfect woman to new heights, with domesticity being sold as the ultimate feminine aspiration. But this didn't erase competition among women. It simply changed their playing field. Chapter 3: The 1950s Housewife versus the Modern Woman. As World War II came to an end, so did the brief moment of independence women had gained during the workforce. During the war, women had taken on jobs in factories, proving that they could work alongside men and contribute beyond the domestic sphere. But by 1945, soldiers were returning home, and the government, media, and corporate America pushed hard to put women back into their traditional roles. This wasn't just a cultural shift, it was a strategic campaign. The economic boom of the 50s depended on consumerism, and what better way to sell products than by convincing women that their ultimate fulfillment came from creating the perfect home. The media flooded magazines, advertisements, and television with images of the ideal housewife, a woman whose life revolved around cooking, cleaning, raising children, and most importantly, keeping her husband happy. But this wasn't just about being a good wife, it was also about being the best wife. Women were subtly and sometimes blatantly encouraged to compete with one another. The rise of suburban living created an environment where women were constantly comparing their homes, their children, and their marriages. Who had the tidiest house? Who threw the best dinner party? Whose husband had the best job? This pressure created a quiet but powerful rivalry among women, reinforcing the idea that their worth was measured by their ability to conform to this ideal. Women who struggled with housework, weren't perfectly polished, or expressed dissatisfaction with their roles were often viewed as failures, outliers who didn't fit the mold of what a woman should be. Magazines and advice columns played a significant role in reinforcing these standards. Women's publications were filled with tips on how to remain desirable to their husbands, how to keep the perfect home, and perhaps most interestingly, how to avoid being one of those women who couldn't keep a man. Advice columns warned against being too assertive, too career-driven, and too opinionated. Articles with titles like "Are You a Good Wife?" or "10 Ways to Keep Him Interested" promoted the idea that women had to work tirelessly to maintain male approval. If a marriage failed, the blame almost always fell on the wife, never the husband. This era saw an early form of the pick-me mindset, not through overt rejection of femininity, but through the internalized belief that other women who didn't perfectly embody the domestic ideal were inferior. A good wife didn't just embrace her role, she subtly distanced herself from those who didn't measure up. While the ideal woman of the 1950s was a devoted housewife, an opposing archetype was also emerging, the career woman. Unlike the angel of the house, this woman was framed as selfish, unfeminine, and ultimately doomed to a life of loneliness. Movies and TV shows reinforce this idea, portraying women who prioritize work over marriage as either comedic punchlines or tragic figures. Even in Pillow Talk, Doris Day's character is initially portrayed as too independent and career-focused, only to be saved by love. In How to Marry a Millionaire, the central lesson was that financial independence was nothing compared to securing a wealthy husband. The message was clear. Women who pursued careers are rejected. Traditional roles were undesirable. You can even see this when you watch Mad Men. Even like Joan was considered almost like the joke of the office, and even Peggy, because she was so career-driven. So you could see how they were doing that in Mad Men, and then Betty was like considered the ideal woman and housewife. And this created a divide among women, those who conformed to domesticity and those who dared to break away. Women who embraced the housewife ideal often positioned themselves as superior to those who didn't, reinforcing the idea that good women distance themselves from those who didn't fit societal expectations. And it's also true, if you notice, like a lot of couples don't necessarily like the single women. They're almost a threat, because there's been times in the past, let's say if I was single and then no one wanted you to come along because then the wife would consider you a threat almost. I don't know if anyone else has experienced that. But as the 1960s arrived, cracks began to form in the housewife ideal. Many women found themselves deeply unhappy despite living in the so-called perfect life. Betty Friedman's The Feminine Mystique, published in 1963, exposed the silent struggles of housewives who felt unfulfilled and trapped in their domestic roles. This dissatisfaction fueled the rise of second-wave feminism, which challenged the notion that a woman's worth was tied solely to her ability to be a good wife and mother. Women began questioning why their value was measured in relation to men and why they were discouraged from pursuing their own dreams and ambitions. But this shift didn't eliminate competition among women, it simply changed its nature. The rise of feminism introduced a new dynamic. the empowered, independent woman versus the traditional housewife. Some women fully embraced feminism, while others resisted it, fearing it would disrupt the roles they had been taught to embrace. This created yet another division, reinforcing the idea that women had to align themselves with one ideal and reject another. As feminism gained traction, media narratives shifted again. Women were no longer expected to only be housewives, but they still weren't entirely free from societal expectations. Instead of competing for the best home and husband, women in the 80s and 90s were encouraged to embody a new kind of ideal, the cool girl. The cool girl wasn't obsessed with the domestic perfection. She was effortlessly sexy, laid back, and most importantly, not like the other women, who were too needy, too emotional, or too high maintenance. Instead of distancing themselves from career women or housewives, the next generation of women would learn to distance themselves from femininity altogether. The shift laid the foundation for the pick-me girl of the modern era, one who rejects traditional femininity, but in the same name of feminism. Instead, she does it to gain male validation, positioning herself as superior to the other women who embrace the traits that society has long deemed too much. Chapter 4: The Cool Girl and Early 2000s Pop Culture. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, pop culture gave us a new female archetype to admire, the cool girl. She was the ultimate fantasy for the male gaze. Beautiful, fun, and most importantly, effortlessly chill. She drank beer, she loved burgers, she watched sports, and had no interest in the so-called girly things that other women obsessed over. Think about Lainey Boggs and She's All That, a quirky, misunderstood artist who rejects makeup and heels, only to have her beauty discovered when she puts on a dress and takes off her glasses. Or Kat Stratford in 10 Things I Hate About You, a rebellious, sharp-tongued feminist who sneers at her more traditionally feminine peers while reluctantly falling for the bad boy. And I saw both of these movies in the theater and in high school, so I really vividly remember because the theater was packed for both of them. I think that was back in the day when people actually went to movies and it was like, you know, a huge deal to go on like Saturday night. And these characters became cultural icons, celebrated for their supposed rejection of traditional femininity and their willingness to be one of the guys. But as empowering as these characters might have seemed at first glance, their appeal wasn't truly rooted in self-expression. Instead, the cool girl archetype was about performance. She was a woman who molded herself into the perfect companion for men, often at the expense for female solidarity. Gillian Flynn's Gone Girl tore apart the cool girl archetype in a way that made audiences stop and think. In her now famous monologue, Flynn's character Amy Doon explains how women twist themselves into male fantasies, pretending to love things like football, steak, and comic books to seem relatable and low maintenance. Flynn's critique resonated because it exposed the double standards baked into this archetype. The cool girl wasn't just a relaxed, confident woman. She was a woman pretending to be whatever a man wanted her to be, hiding any interests or behaviors that might be deemed too feminine, needy, or complicated. This wasn't just liberation. It was another form of self-assurance. At its core, the cool girl trope asks women to compete for male approval, not by embracing femininity, but by rejecting it altogether and framing other women as lesser for not doing the same. Hollywood wasn't just reflecting this dynamic, it was actively reinforcing it. The cool girl was celebrated in countless movies, often as a love interest who stood out because she wasn't like the other girls. She was written as effortlessly attractive without trying too hard, and dismissive of other women who cared about things like makeup, fashion, or romance. And these narratives subtly taught audiences that traditional feminine traits were frivolous or shallow, and that the ideal woman was the one who distanced herself from other women. In essence, the cool girl became a pick-me prototype, gaining male approval by making herself seem superior to her female peers. But the cool girl ideal came with an unspoken set of rules. She had to be hot, but not high maintenance, smart, but not intimidating, funny, but never crude. Essentially, she was expected to embody every male fantasy without ever seeming like she was trying too hard. This created a trap for women who aspired to the cool girl standard. On one hand, it offered an escape from the pressure of traditional femininity. On the other hand, it forced women to suppress their individuality and conform to a different, equally limiting mold. Worse, it perpetuated internalized misogyny by encouraging women to look down on femininity and those who embraced it. The cool girl archetype didn't just fade away, it evolved. As social media exploded in the 2010s, the qualities of the cool girl were rebranded into what we now know as the pick-me girl. The pick-me girl girl also rejects traditional femininity, but her approach is more explicit. She actively distances herself from other women, using phrases like, "I'm not like other girls," and shaming behaviors that are seen as too feminine or attention-seeking. While the cool girl was often portrayed as effortlessly cool, the pick-me girl's behavior is far more performative. Amplified by the visibility of social media platforms, social media has made it possible for women to broadcast their rejection of femininity to a global audience, while simultaneously creating new ways for them to be judged and critiqued by their peers. In many ways, the cool girl paved the way for the pick-me girl. Both archetypes reflect the same underlying struggle: women navigating a world that pits them against other women, forcing them to perform in ways that prioritize male validation over their own individuality. But the rise of the pick-me girl also signals a shift. Women are now more aware of these dynamics, calling out internalized misogyny and challenging the idea that we have to reject femininity to be taken seriously. And social media has turned the pick-me girl into a meme, but it also sparked important conversations about why these archetypes exist in the first place. The cool girl may have been celebrated in the early 2000s, but today she's being re-examined through a more critical lens. We're starting to see more diverse representations of women in media, showing that femininity isn't a weakness, and individuality doesn't have to come from the expense of another woman. So what do you think? Are we finally moving past the cool girl or pick-me girl archetype, or will we continue to evolve in new ways? So let me know in the comments below. I mean, I always think there's just, women are always going to be competing with each other in one way or another. In chapter 5, social media and the rise of the pick-me girl. So social media brought the pick-me girl into the spotlight, but it also gave her a new level of scrutiny. With all these platforms, she evolved, and the pick-me girl is a fascinating example of how women navigate double standards. On one hand, they're pressured to conform to male expectations. On the other hand, they're criticized for trying too hard. So what's particularly interesting is how women have reclaimed their narrative using humor and on social media. So can we break the cycle? So what can we learn from the rise and fall of the pick-me girl? It's easy to mock the stereotype, but it's more productive to understand where it comes from. For centuries, women have been conditioned to compete for male approval, often at the expense of their relationships with other women. By understanding the historical roots of this behavior, we can work towards breaking the cycle. And the pick-me girl isn't just a TikTok trend, it's a reflection of the ongoing struggles women face in navigating societal expectations. And I just feel like I don't think we're witnessing the end of it. I just think women will always be competing with each other in some ways. I remember when I was younger, like I would try to conform more to what I think like guys would like, but now I just honestly I could care less. But I think when you're younger, when you're kind of more trying to find yourself, I mean, I had other friends that tried to be like the domestic girl that was really good at cooking and decorating, and then that didn't work, and they tried to be more athletic and stuff. And then I think everyone just eventually, you just kind of like give up and you're like, I'm just gonna be myself because I don't care anymore. But I think that's just a part of like coming of age and like finding yourself and just kind of getting to a point. I think as you get older, you just start caring less, to be honest. So it's interesting to see the historical perspective and how social media has really amplified this. So let me know in the comments below. Have you ever tried to be the pick-me girl, or do you know any women like that? Let me know. All right, thanks for watching.